All again, thank you for coming. I'm Toby Gordon-Dichter. Thank you for the Meelya Gordon Memorial Lecture is why you're here. No, you're really here because of Jay Winik. And it's a very fitting lecture because tonight's book is about momentous decisions in the face of enormous challenge. With the city in brilliant esteem right now, we still have an education crisis, a budget crunch, a digital divide, deep poverty, and safety issues for our children. To all these challenges, your libraries make a difference. We bring solutions. Our strategy has changed. We are no longer a repository of books. We are citadels of information, service, and support. So don't just judge us on the 130 fabulous lectures that we have of the author series or by our crummy bathrooms. Please know that the foundation dollars create, develop, and staff these amazing programs. And I know that from looking at the faces tonight, you're all asked for a lot and you all do a lot. But at least go to the website freelibrary.gov and .org and check out what's going on. I hope you all I'll see you all at the Alice 150 Ball, December 5th. And now to tonight. To me, Jay Winik is the Edward R. Murrow through paper. When you read his books, you experience the pain and fears and triumph of the moment. So a chapter ends with FDR's gray pallor and terrible stomach pains, and you turn the page, and you're all about government in Britain and Germany and America. His books rivet you on a moment in time that have changed the world. From his book, April 1865, The Month That Saved America, some of you may have seen it as a documentary, but you know, that was the #1 bestseller. It pushed everything else off the list at the time. To The Great Upheaval, which is a wonderful book about the birth of the modern world, but it sets anything you knew about the Founding Fathers in an entirely different light from a big global perspective. And knowing all of you, not all of you, but I hope to know all of you, but many of you, the fact that you are so intellectually curious means that you will love these books. And the book tonight about 1944 and FDR actually launched 2 weeks ago, and 6 days later, and we have this announcement tonight, became on the bestseller, #9, the very first week it's out. So it is a really, yes. You may have heard Jay Winik on radio and television or read his columns in the Wall Street Journal or New York Times. He was born in Connecticut. He's taught at his alma mater, which is Yale, and George Washington University and the University of Maryland. Earlier, he had a distinguished government career in national security and foreign policy, including assisting 2 secretaries of defense and helping to create the landmark United Nations plan for ending the Cambodian Civil War. He's been in the thick of civil wars from around the globe, from the former Yugoslavia to El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Cambodia. Jay Winik's ability to deconstruct the simultaneous forces of history and bind them together again with the voice of a master storyteller really shines through in this one. This newest book, 1944, FDR and the Year That Changed History, I agree with what Walter Isaacson said. He said, to understand the 20th century, you need to understand 1944. The Wall Street Journal chose April 1865, his first book, as the first book President Obama should read for his second term. On the eve of the bombing of the campaign against Afghanistan, Vice President Cheney had Dr. Winik to dinner to discuss lessons from history on the war on terror. And President Bill Clinton is an avid fan, as are many in government and military leadership, seeking insights from his lessons in history. So particularly in an age when we're crying for the appropriate responses to human suffering, this is a really important book to read. It is a terrific read. I only have one problem with it. Once you start, you can't put it down, and it's a big book. It's really thick to carry around. But if we had all had Jay Winik as our history teacher, I think we'd all be historians today because he is just marvelous. Dear friends, please join me in welcoming Jay Winik.
Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Toby. And boy, you guys really have just an extraordinary library here. It's so impressive. And I want to add, you've got great leadership for the library and a really first-class staff. Okay. All right, let's get right into the talk tonight to 1944. 1944. In 1944, it was not inevitable that the war would end as it did or that it would end well at all. Indeed, along the Western Front, the Allies, the American soldiers, were pinned down under the withering fire of the Germans along the Gustav Line. In the East, the Soviet Union was still talking about making a separate peace with Adolf Hitler even then. And so, in other words, going into 1944, the war and humanity still remained very much in doubt. And so what would commence from there would be the most epic year of the war, and indeed the most epic year perhaps in human history. Now, against this backdrop for a second, I want you to consider two of the great leaders of the Allies meeting with each other. The first is Winston Churchill. Churchill, with his kind of growly face and his plummy voice, and who by his force of will refused to give up and give in as one after another of the Allied countries would fall under the Nazi swastika. And then there was Winston Churchill's partner, Franklin Roosevelt. Think of Roosevelt for a second, if you will. Here he was, a crippled by polio, who had gotten elected and reelected 4 times. Here was Roosevelt, who with his fireside chats uplifted a dispirited nation during the darkest days of the Depression. Here was Roosevelt, whose oratory was the stuff of legend, and who was incomparable in the minds of Americans. And these two men would be meeting with each other in Cairo, where they would talk about what was going to happen next in the war. But before they would talk about what would happen next in the war, when they would meet with Joseph Stalin later in Tehran, Churchill would burst into the villa where Roosevelt was staying, and he said, "Mr. President, I've arranged something for us. You must come with me. We must go see the pyramids." And so Roosevelt tried to get himself up from his chair, a rare lapse, and then he realized he couldn't do it, and then he sat back down again. And they motored out as the sunset was arriving. It was darkened by the pyramids. There was a pink line that was kind of descending, a little bit of curtain falling right there. And Churchill and Roosevelt sat there, and they first looked at the pyramids, and then they looked at the Sphinx. And at one point, Churchill says, "I wonder what she has to say." And then another point he said about Roosevelt himself, he said, "My God, I love that man." And what did Roosevelt say? Well, he said nothing, because as it turned out, he was as inscrutable as the Sphinx itself was. But anyway, so from there they would move from Cairo to Tehran. And once in Tehran, they would meet to discuss strategy and tactics in the rest of the war and how to bring the war to a close. And Roosevelt, when he first met with Stalin, interestingly enough, Stalin would walk into the room, and Roosevelt thought he would charm him as he charmed everyone else. And then all of a sudden, Stalin's eyes go up and down. He was staring at the president as almost nobody had ever stared at him. Roosevelt was in a wheelchair, and he was looking at his shriveled legs. But from there, they talked about strategy. They talked about tactics. They talked about the D-Day invasion that Stalin was hoping would come. And then at a certain point, something very dramatic, very strange happened. Great beads of sweat would come down on the forehead of Roosevelt. And then all of a sudden, he couldn't talk. He began to gasp. He was in pain. He was quickly whisked off to a back room where his personal physician, Admiral McIntyre, examined him. And McIntyre said, well, it was really nothing more than a case of indigestion, and pronounced him all right to continue with the summit. But it was very clear there was something wrong with Roosevelt, and he was ailing, and that this was an omen of things to come. But nonetheless, The summit would be concluded soon thereafter, and it would be a great success. The two most important things to come out of the summit would be the following. They would decide upon the date for D-Day, which would happen in the beginning of June. And then they would also arrive at the fact that that Roosevelt would choose the commander of the Allied forces. And that, of course, would be Dwight Eisenhower. So with that, Roosevelt would return back to the United States. He wasn't feeling that great, but he felt all was well with the world. So far away from the blood-soaked battlefields, far away from the men dying day after day and hour after hour and minute after minute, Roosevelt felt all was well with the world. The war was going just as it should go. But nonetheless, when he got home, and it was Christmas time, and he gathered his family for his ritualistic reading of Dickens, all of a sudden, again, he didn't feel well. He had a fever that wouldn't quit. He had a hacking cough that wouldn't quit. He had a sense of dizziness that wouldn't stop. And indeed, he was so sick that when he went back to Washington and he was trying to sign his correspondence, he could barely do more than a scrawl for his name. In fact, the staff would come in and they would be stunned to see his mouth hanging open, his eyes looking glassy. And several times the Secret Service would actually come into the Oval Office, and what did they find? Well, they found the president sprawled on the ground. He had fallen out of his chair or fallen out of his wheelchair. He was deeply sick. So he was so sick that he went to Bethesda Naval, and at Bethesda Naval he had a full workup. And it was clear he had congestive heart failure and a number of other maladies. And Dr. Bruin, the doctor there at the time, he said, if something dramatic doesn't happen, and if you don't get significant rest, you will be dead within a year. And indeed, those words would prove to be prophetic. So it would be decided that he would rest. He would go down south, and he would rest in South Carolina at Bernard Baruch's estate. Bernard Baruch was one of the statesmen or the elders of the administration and a good friend of Roosevelt's. And Roosevelt was supposed to stay there for 2 weeks, but in fact he would stay there for a full month. He was so sick. So the question would be, what would happen next? Well, as he was recuperating in South Carolina, far away from the battlefields, it turned out the war was going well. The Allied powers captured Rome, one of the symbols of the Axis powers. The Allied powers then eventually took the airfields at Foggia, which gave them complete mastery of the skies. Indeed, as far as 620 miles off, or in the deep recesses of the woods of Poland, was a place called Auschwitz. And also at this time, Italy itself would soon fall, and with that, one of the Axis powers is gone, and as Roosevelt would say, one up, one to go. And now it would fall to D-Day to decide the fate of this war and the fate of this battle. And so with D-Day, I want you to consider it for a second. D-Day, the greatest battle in all of history. D-Day, the greatest armada ever assembled and ever witnessed in history. 5,000 ships on the shoreline. 180,000 men being carried upon those 5,000 ships. 2,000 planes blanketing the sky. And this great armada would then be arrayed against Rommel and against the Germans, all converging on five separate points, literally without parallel. And if D-Day succeeded, it would be the greatest battle of the war, and indeed the greatest battle of history. But from the very beginning, actually, it turned out that D-Day was in peril. It seemed like the invasion itself might be aborted. Dwight Eisenhower, the commander of the forces, would meet with his top aides. And it turned out he learned from his meteorologist that a great storm had been whipped up. Great gust winds were gusting all over the coast, making it impossible for planes even to fly. And the rains were rattling the rooftops. The rains were rattling the houses. The rains were rattling all the weapons of war. And they were rattling as far as hundreds of miles into Europe, where Adolf Hitler was falling asleep that night. And so Eisenhower walked around, his chin to his chest. He paced one way. He paced another way. He stuck his chin in his chest again. Then he sat down on his couch, and he said to the meteorologist, "It seems inconceivable that we could wage a battle with these terrible torrential rains and these winds like this." And at that point, he decided that they would call off the great invasion, and they would reconvene within a day. So when they reconvened again, At one point, Eisenhower said, "I don't know how much longer we can leave this battle hanging out on a limb." But the meteorologist gave him very crucial information this time around. He said soon there would be a break of 36 hours, and those 36 hours would constitute that window upon which they could initiate this great invasion. So Eisenhower looked at his staff. He polled them, one after the other after the other. They split right down the middle, 6 for, 6 against. Eisenhower sat down on the couch. He was quiet. He was pensive. He looked tense and worn. And then eventually he stood up. He said, "Okay then, we will go. Let's go." And with that, what would commence would be the greatest invasion, the greatest armada in history. And think of this great invasion from the German side for a second. Along the Atlantic Wall, the fortified Nazi defenses in France, they were looking out and they saw nothing but choppy seas and nothing but water. And Erwin Rommel, the great general who was going to command the defense, he said to his staff, he said, "This war will be won or lost on the beaches." And then faithfully he added, "It will be the longest day." Well, it was the longest day. Soon they were looking out, and all of a sudden the Germans saw a ship. Then they saw another ship. Then they saw another ship. Then they saw a galaxy of ships. Then they saw a universe of ships. And then they saw nothing, no longer water anymore, nothing but ships. And they said, "Tora, Tora, Tora." And with that, the battle commenced. And very quickly, the Allies made short work of the Nazis. On 4 critical beaches, they quickly rolled up the Germans, and everything was going well. But on Omaha Beach, it was a very different story. Despite the cannonading, despite the battleships, despite the roar and the thunder, so much roaring and thunder of guns that it was as if the heavens had opened up their primordial wrath, the Allies were getting cut down one after another from the withering fire from the Germans. The soldiers were having their heads blown off. You could see arms ripped off from bodies, bleeding into the water. And you saw people dying, one after another, one after another. The command structure was dying. The generals were getting killed. And it was literally a bloodbath. And it seemed at one point, as General Omar Bradley put it, he said, "My God, this is a crisis of irreversible proportions." And it seemed like there was no way they could actually win this battle. But then, in a triumph of ingenuity, in a triumph of courage, in a triumph of improvisation, the regular enlisted men started taking matters into their own hands. And at one point, another one of the men said, "Men, we might as well die on the ground as we do in the water." And so they started pushing forward. And soon enough, in a little miracle after miracles, they did something. They seized the high ground. And upon seizing the high ground, it was clear that D-Day was won. And with the winning of D-Day, which was about to happen, it was clear that Hitler's fate was sealed. On the military field of battle, the war was going well. But as the war was going well, as the empire of war was crumbling in the Nazi Third Reich, there's one other thing that was not crumbling, and that was the empire of death. That was the epicenter of the final solution. That was the gas chambers of Auschwitz. I want to remind you for a second just what Auschwitz was. Auschwitz was where the innocent Jews of Hungary were going to be taken. And remember for a second, what was taking place was we had a dying Roosevelt, a man who was so sick that he could barely rouse himself out of his chair sometimes. We had the most critical military effort of the war, and that was D-Day. Now we had the most profound military, not just military, but moral crisis in history, and that was the rounding up of some 750,000 Hungarian Jews who would be taken to Auschwitz to be gassed. I want you to wrap your minds for a second around this figure of 750,000. If you took the population of Boston and multiplied it by 2 twice over at the time and put everyone in Boston on trains and took them from Boston and moved them to Washington and then murdered them one by one, this is what was happening to those Hungarian Jews who were being rounded up. And when they were rounded up, they were put in cattle cars. And these cattle cars had very little light, no food, no water, and virtually no air. It was a 3-day trip. And more often than not, people would literally die just standing up in these cattle cars. And in fact, at one point, a trainload bearing 4,000 children arrived at Auschwitz. And when the Nazi SS opened up the doors, what did they find? They found that every child was dead. They had suffocated en route. And indeed, when most of the Jews arrived at Auschwitz, what they would do is they would stumble out. They'd be tired, and they'd be worn, they'd be disoriented, they'd be terrified, and they wouldn't know what was happening next. They would see these great plumes of fire going into the sky. These flames, of course, were from the crematoria. And they would smell a smell like nothing they'd ever smelled. And of course, that smell was of broiling flesh from people being shoved into the gas ovens. And then they would hear these barking dogs, German shepherds, barking, barking, barking. And they would hear these Gestapo officials saying, "Raus, raus, raus, out, out, out." And as they would stumble out, they'd be terrified. And Nazi doctors would be doing this. They would be standing on a platform, and they'd be going, "You to the right, you to the left, you to the right, you to the left, you to the right, you to the left." If you were told to go to the right, you were going to become a slave laborer, and you would be worked to death usually within a matter of months, and more often than not, within a matter of weeks. If you were told to go to the left, you were a grandmother, you were a grandfather, you were a mother, or you were a little child. Because for Adolf Hitler in the Third Reich, it was always about the children. And then you were going to go to the gas chamber. One little girl said to her father, she said, "Daddy, will there be playgrounds here just like at home?" But another little girl knew better. She looked over at her father and she said, "Of what use is there a God in a world where the only duty is to punish?" So these Jews would be taken and they would be moved to these cold and forbidding gas chambers. And before they would be actually moved into the chambers themselves, they would be told to undress. And they would be told, "You will have to take a shower. You will be disinfected from your long journey that you had taken." And then they would be told, "Remember the hooks where your clothes would go, because that's where you will go afterwards." And then somebody might say, "I want to be with my father afterwards," or "I want to be with my mother." And very cruelly, the Germans would say, "Yes, yes, you will be together afterwards." Or an elderly couple who had been married for 45 or 55 years would say, "We want to be together with each other." And they would say, "Yes, together afterwards, always together afterwards." And then they would be undressed. They would move into these cold and forbidding chambers. And on the walls were something very striking. There were faint scratches, hard to decipher. And then the lights would go on and the lights would go off. The lights would go on and the lights would go off. As it turned out, the SS was sadistically and cruelly mocking the Jews, making fun of them. And then all of a sudden the gas would come out. And as it would come out, there would be a great rush. They couldn't breathe. And people would be trammeling each other. And sadly, tragically, they would be trammeling little children, or they would be trammeling the elderly, as they would be rushing for the doors or somehow to get to where there was oxygen or air to breathe. But there was no air to breathe. At first there would be screaming, and then the screaming would become a rattle, and then the rattle would become a death rattle, and then the rattle would become a squeak, and then after 20 minutes there would be nothingness. They would all be dead. And after having arrived at Auschwitz station, little did they know that within an hour or an hour and a half, they would all be nothing but ashes and dust. And then so that was Auschwitz. And the question is what would happen to Auschwitz? What would Franklin Roosevelt do? Well, Franklin Roosevelt was now presiding over this great armada, this winning of D-Day, this destruction of the Nazi war machine. But there was one man at Auschwitz. His name was Rudolf Verba, an inmate. He was 19 years old. He was uniquely of good health. And he was something that was almost also very unique at Auschwitz. He had an administrative position. He was a registrar, so he knew everything that was taking place. He knew about the transports. He knew about the millions of dead. He knew how they were killed. He knew how the gas chambers actually worked. And he was determined to do something that no Jew had ever done, but to escape. And he would try to escape with another colleague or an old friend from Slovakia. And the way he would do it is he would actually hide out in a little woodpile, in a cavity of a woodpile, because he reasoned if they could stay there for 3 days, after 3 days the SS would actually call off the search and would be turned over into the rest of the countryside by the Gestapo. So they got into the woodpile and they waited. 5:20 came, No noise. Nothing happened. 5:45 came, nothing happened. 6 o'clock, still nothing happened. And they were holding their breath. It was stuffy. They were kind of sitting bird-like. It was totally pitch black. And then all of a sudden at 6:15, the sirens came. They heard the barking dogs, some 3,000 of them, combing the total environs of Auschwitz, looking for them. They heard some 4,000 men, German patrols, SS patrols, Gestapo patrols, looking for them, combing every little nook and cranny of Auschwitz, trying to find them. But after 3 days, it turned out they had not been discovered. Indeed, at one point, even the dogs were on top of the woodpile, but got foiled because what these two men had done is they had put German tobacco and Russian tobacco, which foiled the scent. So eventually, they heard a shout, "Cordon down!" and they called off the search internally within Auschwitz. Night came, and as night came, they heard these eerie sounds, these clink and clank, clink and clank, clink and clank. The empire of death was continuing. More Jews were being shoved in the ovens. And then they heard something else, this exhilarating sound. They heard airplanes flying above, and then bombs. And they thought, my God, are they coming to save us? Are the Allies finally coming to bomb Auschwitz? But no, it turns out they were bombing 5 miles away. But then they got themselves out of the woodpile. They turned around. They saw these great plumes of smoke, and they smelt the broiling flesh. And then they turned around and they ran, and they never looked back. For 17 days, tired, unwashed, looking disgusting, smelling disgusting, having nothing to eat, they eluded Nazi patrols. They eluded anti-Semites. They eluded the Gestapo. And they eluded death at least 3 separate times. And eventually they would make their way to Slovakia, where they sat down with the Jewish elders of Slovakia, and they recounted in grim detail everything of Auschwitz, all the ways of Auschwitz, how the German death machine would operate. And in telegraphed form, 3 pages of this would be sent to Washington, to the White House, to tell FDR what was happening. And then soon the longer version, the 30-page version, would be sent to the White House to tell FDR what was happening. So what would happen? Well, as it turns out, nothing would happen. Nothing at all. In fact, for 14 months, the West had been getting information in bits and drabs and pieces, first in little bits, and then in a torrent, and then in a rush. In fact, as early as 1942, they would get information from one of the highest sources imaginable, and this reads like a thriller in the Third Reich, and that was from a man named Eduard Schulte. Eduard Schulte was a German industrialist who was very highly placed within the German regime, and he had even met Adolf Hitler at one point, and he knew Himmler, who was the architect of the final solution, and it turned out that Schulte was a rampant anti-Nazi. He despised the Nazis. And he was at a party, and in this party, where men were dressed in their finest outfits and their finest uniforms, and where women were wearing furs and wearing jewels and wearing diamonds, all of a sudden he heard Himmler, in very hushed tones, talking about something never heard before, and that was the final solution, the attempt to destroy every Jew on the face of Europe, if not on the face of the planet. And he was so outraged, Schulte, that he resolved he would not only put his job in jeopardy, but his life in jeopardy. And he undertook a series of clandestine meetings in Switzerland where he would meet with Jewish contacts to tell them about what was taking place, to tell them about these ghastly plans, to tell them about the horror that would be known as the final solution. And this information would be telegraphed to Washington, and it would come again from the highest sources of the Third Reich. And what would happen? Nothing. And at the same time, Jews in the tens of thousands and really hundreds of thousands were cramming consulates all over Europe, desperate to get visas, desperate to come into the United States. And what they got was from the State Department, a man named Breckinridge Long, who was head of the visa section, and he was likely tinged with anti-Semitism. And what he said at the time was, we can postpone and postpone and postpone the giving of visas to these people. And that, of course, meant a death sentence. So the question was, once again, what would happen? Well, what would happen would be, after these 14 months, that Henry Morgenthau, the Secretary of the Treasury, he was one of Roosevelt's best friends. They had a standing lunch every Monday at the White House, and he was very influential as the Secretary of the Treasury. And Morgenthau was so disgusted and so horrified at the foot-dragging of the administration, at the reluctance of the administration, at the terrible statistics and the character of the way the Jews were being killed en masse, one by one in the gas chambers, that his department eventually wrote a memoranda to Roosevelt. And this memoranda had to be the hardest hitting memoranda ever written to a president ever in this nation's history. It talked about the administration's complicity in the murder of the Jews. Now, as I say this, I want you to remember Roosevelt for a second. Here was Roosevelt, this great president. Here was Roosevelt, the man who in the darkest days rescued the nation from the Depression. Here was Roosevelt, when the nation was in the deepest elements of despair, uplifted the country with his fireside chats. Here was Roosevelt, who through his fertile imagination came up with the Lend-Lease, which kept the British alive and the Soviet Union alive in their darkest days. Here was Roosevelt, who with his fertile imagination came up with the North Africa campaign. And the North Africa campaign was the campaign that Dwight Eisenhower said was the blackest day in American history because he thought it was such a failed effort. But it turned out that Roosevelt was right. This was a campaign that gave valuable seasoning to the Americans and boosted morale and was a critical prelude to the Italian campaign and then to D-Day itself. It seemed that nothing escaped the wisdom, the vision, and the fertile imagination of Roosevelt but one thing, and that was the Holocaust unfolding slowly within his own sight. So the question is what would happen next? Well, what would happen next is that upon receiving this memo from Henry Morgenthau, it immediately shocked Roosevelt. He knew he had to do something or it would be a scandal of historic proportions. He called Morgenthau into a rare Sunday meeting into the second floor Oval Office, and immediately they set up something called the War Refugee Board, designed to do nothing but help the Jews. But of course, at this point, in 1944, it was too little, it was too late. In fact, it was in millions of cases too little, too late. But anyway, nonetheless, several 100,000 lives would be saved from the War Refugee Board. And then would come something else. A fateful debate, a fateful discussion would arise in the administration. And that would be about bombing the death halls of Auschwitz, bombing the railways to Auschwitz, putting an end to this bestiality that was the epicenter of the final solution. And so would they bomb Auschwitz? Well, it turned out that John J. McCloy, the point man for Roosevelt in the War Department, he said, no, we should not bomb Auschwitz. And the first reason he gave was our planes can't reach that far. But as it turns out, for months, for some 5 months, American planes have been flying over and around Auschwitz as part of the oil war to degrade the Nazi war machine. And then McCloy said something else. He said, if we bomb Auschwitz, it will lead to even greater vindictive actions on the part of the Nazis. Well, ask yourself a question. What could be more vindictive than shoving innocent civilians, innocent people, little children, because for Hitler it was always about the children, into the gas ovens? And then he said further, beyond that, we can't afford to divert resources to bombing Auschwitz. Well, as it turns out, around the same time, there was something else taking place. And that was in Warsaw, in Poland. The Polish Home Army rose up to fight against their Nazi masters. And they fought heroically, and they tried and failed, and they tried and failed for several weeks. And Churchill was gung-ho at this point to help them out. And Roosevelt agreed. Why did Roosevelt agree? For two reasons. One, he was courting the Polish vote for his re-election in 1944. And then also he wanted to send a signal to the world, a symbol to the world, that in their moment of need, America stood shoulder to shoulder with the Poles. So he sent 107 flying fortresses to reprovision them, to send them aid and assistance and weapons. And he did this knowing full well that they would be cut up in their hour of need. But he did it because he wanted to say, we stand shoulder to shoulder in your time of need. But of course the question arose at the time, well, if we can stand shoulder to shoulder with the Poles, why can't we stand shoulder to shoulder with the Jews? And the answer from the White House was again nothing. And then there was something else that was said at the time. It was too complicated an operation to carry out. Well, that wasn't really quite true, because as it turns out, the RAF, the Royal Air Force, had just carried out a lightning raid in which they struck a prison with Royal Air Force prisoners of war and French resistant prisoners of war. And they hit one side of the prison and another side of the prison, and they took reconnaissance photos of it. And the reconnaissance photos were really quite striking. They were quite dramatic. What did they show? They showed SS officers in the snow bleeding to death. And they showed men in the hundreds rushing off into the woods where many numbers of them escaped to liberty, escaped to freedom, just as could happen with the Jews if we bombed Auschwitz. But still, Auschwitz was not bombed. So what was Winston Churchill's view on all this? Well, when he heard about what was taking place in the dark forests of Auschwitz, in the dark forests of Poland, he said, "My God, this is the greatest monstrosity that history has ever witnessed in all of mankind." And he said, "Bomb the halls of Auschwitz, use my name and get everything you could out of it." And what came out of the White House? Nothing came out of Auschwitz. Nothing came out of the White House. Auschwitz was never bombed. Well, actually, that's not true. At one point, Auschwitz was bombed on September 13th, 1944, because it was bombed, but by accident. And what was the reaction when it was bombed? Well, when it was bombed, the SS barely even mounted their anti-aircraft guns. They ran into their shelters, they ran underground, and the Jews, remember the Jews for a second. They were so tired, they were so weak, they were so emaciated, they looked like the Walking Dead. They didn't have eyes, they had sockets. They had sockets for eyes. They didn't have hair because their hair had fallen out. They didn't have teeth because their teeth had fallen out. They couldn't stand. They could barely even stoop. They could barely even crawl. But when this happened, they stood up, they pumped their fists in the air, and they cheered. And indeed, the Nobel Prize laureate, the great Elie Wiesel, one of the great moral consciences in the world today, he was in the camp as a little child. And he said faithfully at the time, he said, "We do not fear death, not that kind of death." So, Auschwitz would never be formally bombed. Soon thereafter, Franklin Roosevelt, his health failing, would give out. He would die in the South in Warm Springs. And then soon thereafter that, Adolf Hitler, seeing that the war was about to end, that he was about to be taken prisoner, he committed suicide. Weirdly, ironically, almost hard to imagine, the two men would die at virtually the same time of day. Not the same day, but at virtually the same time of day. And then eventually the Germans would unconditionally surrender. And when they unconditionally surrendered, here then we see what 1944 was all about. Whether you were in Rome, whether you were in Paris, whether you were in Washington, D.C., whether you were in Moscow, whether you were in Ankara, people the world over, they cheered, "Long live the great Americans." They cheered, "Long live the great Franklin Roosevelt." And as Churchill put it at the time, he said this was the greatest outpouring, the greatest outburst of joy ever witnessed by mankind. This, then, was one of the fruits of 1944. But then there's another fruit of 1944, and I want you to think about it for a second. I call it the emancipation moment. I say that Roosevelt missed his emancipation moment. Remember what Abraham Lincoln did in the Great Civil War. The war was started over the preservation of Union. It was started over geography, and it would consume some 620,000 lives. And by 1862, when Lincoln saw a chance, he did something quite remarkable. He promulgated the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves. And he freed the slaves even though this was greatly resisted in the North. He freed the slaves even though this was greatly resisted within his own political party. And he freed the slaves even though, even within his own cabinet, they had great hesitations. But he did it because it was right. And he turned a struggle that was about geography into this human campaign of morality, this campaign about liberty, this campaign about humanity. And then what happened with Roosevelt? Roosevelt, the world's foremost humanitarian, when confronted with the world's foremost humanitarian crisis, almost inexplicably flinched. He never found his emancipation moment. So in the end, we see that 1944 was a time of exhilaration, the winning of the war. But 1944 also had another fruit, a more poisonous fruit, a sad fruit. 1944, in addition to being about winning the war, was about those lives not just in the tens, not just in the thousands, not just in the hundreds of thousands, but in the millions of people, of children, of mothers, of grandparents who somehow slipped through their fingers and we could have helped and didn't help. 1944 was a time of a great turning point and exhilaration, but it was also a time of great moral sadness and tragedy, and a terrible time for humanity. Thank you very much. Okay, I'll take questions. Do we have microphones that we're gonna have a roving microphone? You were first, sir. No, you. Yeah, right here. He's in the middle.
The information coming from Europe must have been going through the American military, not just through the McCoy and the CIA. Can you talk a bit about the attitudes and the recommendations that were coming from Eisenhower and Marshall and other military leaders?
You mean in terms of what to do about the final solution? All right, the question is what did the military have to say about the final solution? Let me just fast forward a little bit for a second, because I think this is a crucial part of the story. At a certain point near the end of the war, the American military liberated one of the satellite camps. It was the Soviets who liberated Auschwitz, but we liberated a camp called Ohrdruf. Now, Ohrdruf was not a death camp in the way we know the worst of the death camps. It was not a Treblinka. It was not a Dachau. It was not a Mauthausen. It was not an Auschwitz. It was certainly not an Auschwitz. But nonetheless, what they saw there just shocked them in the ways that they had never believed they could be shocked. They saw these stacks of human remains, of bony remains, one after another, stacked like cordwood. They saw these people who could barely walk, these people who could barely look, these people who could barely talk, who kind of stumbled literally like the Walking Dead. I mean, people who were so sick and so ravenous that when they were given cigarettes to smoke, they actually ate them. People who were so ravenous that when they were given chocolate bars, the GIs thought they were helping them. They died because their systems couldn't take it anymore. And Patton, think of Patton, General Patton, one of our great generals, this fierce general. He had seen the worst of battle. He had seen everything one can imagine that could be seen. And when he saw what was taking place in this small little satellite death camp, he vomited. He couldn't bear it. And tellingly enough, Eisenhower, when he saw this, he made all of the Germans within the local area walk around and see what their army had wrought. And then he also said something else quite telling. And imagine this is after 1944. He said, finally, we now know, the GI now knows what we have been fighting for. Finally, the GIs now know what we have been fighting against. That's remarkable. So in terms of what did they do? Well, their task was given to them by Roosevelt, which was to win the war as quickly as possible. And indeed, that was one of the rejoinders from Roosevelt whenever he was asked to do something about the Jews. He would say the best way to help the Jews was to win the war as quickly as possible. And the rejoinder to that was given at the time by the prominent, influential weekly, The Nation. The Nation wrote, sure, the best way to help the Jews is by winning the war quickly as possible, if there are any Jews left. Yes, sir.
I do not know enough about how the structure of military responsibility was put into place. But if Churchill was as intent about doing something about it, couldn't he have on his own just ordered a few RAF missions or one mission of a few aircraft? I mean, what would Roosevelt have done to him?
Right.
Insulted him in some way? Or,
right.
I mean, he couldn't fire him.
Right. Well, look, I mean, Roosevelt and Churchill were very dear friends. They collaborated and colluded on virtually everything in the war until near the end of the war, when their interests started to diverge and they started departing with each other. Churchill, I mean, it's hard to imagine two greater leaders than Roosevelt on one hand and Churchill on the other. but they were entirely different men. And I'll get to the answer to your question in a second. Churchill was warm-blooded. He was emotional. He was eloquent. Now, Roosevelt, to be sure, was eloquent, but Roosevelt was more cold-blooded, more rationalistic, more political. Churchill was visceral. Roosevelt thought with his head. When Churchill immediately said, upon receiving news from this Verber report, this escapees report, my God, this is the greatest monstrosity in the history of mankind. We have to bomb the camps. At that point, it would be staffed through the military, and then typically what would happen is there would be a joint decision between the British military and the American military. And it was just no-go from the American side. So it was just fated not to be. Yes, ma'am.
What exactly is it about FDR's background that made him intransigent on this important issue?
Right.
Was it his parents? Something had happened to him when he was young? How friendly was he growing up with other Jews?
Well, I mean, I've been asked by others. I said, well, in some ways, was FDR anti-Semitic? I think it's safe to say the State Department at the time was tinged with a good dose of anti-Semitism. I mean, Breckinridge Long, at one point, Henry Morgenthau, this is Morgenthau, wrote this memo to Roosevelt talking about the government's acquiescence in the murder of the Jews. Morgenthau actually confronted Long, and he said, frankly, Breck, I've got to tell you, there's those of us around here who think you're a little anti-Semitic. Those are pretty strong words. I think in the War Department, John McCloy, and McCloy is a very great public servant, but McCloy was also the man who was the architect of interning the Japanese long after any rationale for it existed. And McCloy was probably, from his social set, tinged perhaps with an element of anti-Semitism. Enough so that on his deathbed, McCloy, who had had such a distinguished career for the most part, and was so well remembered by history books and by, there's a famous book called The Wise Men, and it was in large part about McCloy. But at the age of 91, he called in a journalist, and he said, well, it wasn't really his doing, that he had raised it directly with Roosevelt himself, and that Roosevelt said, my God, if that happens, we'll be killing some of these people, and I don't want to be accused of being a part of that business. In other words, he was trying to shift the blame onto Roosevelt himself. Now, as to Roosevelt, Roosevelt was determined to win the war as quickly as possible. Now, in 1940, that was a rational goal and rational explanation. 1941 and 1942, that was a rational goal and rational explanation. But after 42 and onward, it was clear, and Roosevelt knew that we were going to win the war. It was just a question of not if, but when. And by 1944, certainly with the winning of D-Day, and we had mastery of the skies, we had mastery of the ground, and the German war machine had literally crumbled and fallen apart. And that was when the 750,000 Hungarian Jews needed us desperately. They needed a champion. They needed a hero. They needed a voice. And that was when we were in a position to do something. And still Roosevelt didn't do it. Was it because he was too sick? Perhaps. Was it because he didn't want to let anything divert him from winning the war? Perhaps. Was it because he was consumed with the mission of setting up the United Nations after the war? Perhaps. But what we do know is that for this great president, this great wartime president, this man who is viewed as a great moral leader, had a moral lapse of proportions that are hard for us, tragically and poignantly, to wrap our hands around. Yes, sir.
How much did electoral politics in America have to do with this? There was a patina of anti-Semitism throughout the country in 1944.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. He asked, how much do electoral politics have to do with this? And I think this is the standard rationale that would defend Roosevelt would say, look, the country was pretty anti-Semitic. It wouldn't go over well. It would undercut the war effort. And I can say several things to that. Firstly, the challenge of presidents is not to be led, but it's to lead. Given the magnitude of the horror of the crisis of proportions that was befitting the Jews, this was the time when it was up to Roosevelt to lead. And then I want you to think by analogy. And then remember for a second, Roosevelt was not your average president. This man knew how to communicate with the American people. I mean, the American people were so charmed with him, so entranced with him, that when they listened to his fireside chats, they felt they were listening to a friend. And if this friend said to them, if he once gave a fireside chat, if he once gave a major speech on the Holocaust, if he once did any of these things, I have no doubt, certainly, as it were later in the war, certainly by 43 and definitely by 1944, they would have followed him. And remember my analogy with Abraham Lincoln for a second. Abraham Lincoln started this war, or waged this war originally about the Union. And then he turned it into a war, and I'm going to use the old-fashioned words that were used at the time. He turned it into a war for the coloreds. And he did this, but he led the country. They didn't want it, they didn't like it, but he led them. And by the end of the war, they followed him to wherever he wanted to take them. And that is why Abraham Lincoln is not only our greatest or one of our two greatest presidents, and he lives not only in our heads, but he lives in our hearts. But Roosevelt, for whatever reason, because I think he was a little bit cool on this issue, and he did only what he had to do, he never saw fit to give that fireside chat. He never saw fit to give that one major speech. Yes, sir. Back there. That's you. No, I know you're okay. No.
Are there no documents analyzing bombing of the railroad leading into Auschwitz and other places? I thought there were in 43 there was some military analysis that would have stopped Auschwitz.
Yeah. The question was, weren't there documents and weren't there pictures that would have enabled us to stop Auschwitz? The one thing I'll say is that there's a difference between bombing the railways of Auschwitz and bombing Auschwitz itself. Bombing railways is a little bit more of a complicated effort because it's a smaller target, and the railways could be built a little more quickly. But I want to remind you, at the time, and this is fascinating, this is very interesting, it is sometimes said that in this discussion that we're looking at it through the 21st century lens or the late 20th century lens. But as it turns out, there's a man named Benjamin Axon who worked for Henry Morgenthau, and he wrote a long and detailed and lengthy memo. And everything we've talked about tonight, he rebutted in that memo itself, and that was in 1944. And one of the things he said is that if we try to bomb the tracks and we bomb the camp itself, it will force the methodical German mind to think of something else to do. It will take away and divert their resources. So he was thinking just the way we're thinking. And then he said, for those who say, as was later said, well, it would lead to the death of some of the Jews themselves, and that would be a terrible business. And in fact, General Petraeus and I had lunch one day, and we talked about it. And he's a great public servant and a great thinker and a great mind. And he said he would have had trouble bombing. But Axon said that was nothing but sheer misplaced sentimentality because they were all going to die anyway. Why not give them a chance? So, but were there actual pictures? There were pictures. There were pictures that were taken, but in one of the ironic and tragic twists of the wheel, the analysts were never tasked with actually analyzing the pictures. So they had them there. They could see the buildings. They could see the tracks. They could even see a long line of people trudging off to the gas chambers, but they weren't analyzed until 1978. Yes, sir.
Franklin Roosevelt was from New York. He had lots of Jewish supporters. My grandmother's generation thought he was, the best thing since sliced bread.
Yeah.
He had a meritocracy in his cabinet. He put Jewish people from New York and other places in important positions in the government based on their capability. And so in many ways he broke ground. How do you reconcile that behavior of his? Because that didn't have any sense that he was discriminating against Jewish people. I mean, he brought the best into government, and if you were Catholic or Jewish or whatever you were, it didn't make that difference. Right. And he had Eleanor as his moral compass. How do you reconcile that with this sort of this is kind of a significant moral lapse in the sense of a guy who already knew that we didn't have horns.
That we didn't have.
Did not have horns.
Oh, horns. Right. Well, there is no doubt Roosevelt, he had many Jewish advisors, and I mean, enough so that the New Deal was often called the Jew deal. And at one point, he said, and this is kind of quite revealing as well, and I think very much to Roosevelt's benefit. He said, I don't know about my ancestors, and I don't know if they were Catholic, if they were Christian, if they were Jewish. What matters is they believe in a higher power. What matters is they believe in a God. And that was his way of saying all Americans have a place at the table in American society. So I don't think in any way, shape, or form was he tinged with anti-Semitism. I don't think he was a prisoner of his class. I think he superseded that. But there is this thorny question, why? Why, as the critics asked, why, as humanitarians asked, in their hour of need, did he not see fit to help out? Why, when his fertile imagination, as I said earlier, could see over the horizon, to see what nobody else could see, time and again on the field of battle, the key policies were made not by his advisors, not by Eisenhower, not by Marshall, not by the highest echelons of the military. It was made by Roosevelt. It was Roosevelt sunning himself on a ship for 8 days who came up with Lend-Lease. It was Roosevelt who came up on his own, along with Churchill, with the North Africa campaign. Time and again, he circumvented his own advisors and decided what to do. But never in this case could he see this man who was this great humanitarian. But in the throes of battle, in the throes of conflict, his health soon failing, he just couldn't see on the moral dimension. And it's one of history's tragic and sad moments, I think. Yes, sir. Okay, this is going to be the last question, I think.
Where was Eleanor Roosevelt in the midst of all of this?
Eleanor was quite an impassioned voice of saying, please help out the Jews. At one point in late 1943 and early 1944, the Jews started speaking up themselves, and they did this despite anti-Semitism in America, and they started trying to exercise more political influence. And at one point, Stephen Wise, the rabbi establishmentarian and a friend of Roosevelt, said, I am demented by my people's grief. And at another point, there was actually full-page ads that were taken out in newspapers saying, for sale for Jews. And this actually, Roosevelt thought it hit a little bit below the belt, and it was embarrassing to him. But Eleanor said at the time, she said her greatest regret was not having done more to help the Jews. So she was really a moral conscience, but she was only one voice of many. That concludes tonight. Thank you very much. You guys have been terrific.